You've reached the Murder Between Friends podcast with Sherrilyn Dale and Gavin Fish. Please stay on the line. This week's episode starts in 3, 2, 1.
Gavin, you are my new co-host.
Here I am. I'm honored.
I'm so pumped. I'm honored that you are here. I think we've got some really fun stuff for everybody to watch. Very much in the opposite attracts, category. Yet we're still very similar. Because I watch all the true crime shows for us. You do not. I have
that is
more
true.
Datelines saved than my PVR can handle. I drink for the two of us.
Yeah.
You do
no,
not.
But we just clicked when we got together in Minnesota looking at the David Elmquist case. We just clicked, and it's really funny to look at the photos that were taken of us. We're completely opposite people, but we've got the same goals when it comes to solving crimes, don't we?
Amen. And I think, that's definitely what attracted me to this partnership. And yeah, like you said, it was just instant connection. That that chemistry is there, and at the end of the day, our end goal is exactly the same, and all of that matters. So I am so excited to see where this adventure takes us. I'm so honored to have you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
In me and the podcast, of course. That being said, we are not messing around. We have already pre-filmed our first episode, and it was a gooder. We were honored to have some pretty big names, two huge victim and survivor advocates, Terra Newell and Collier Landry, on. And if this episode is just a taste of what's to come, I can't wait.
Yeah, these guys are amazing. They're terrific advocates for victims of violent crime because they have been there themselves. So, yeah, it's a great episode.
Amen. Without further ado, you guys, here is our first episode back with Murder Between Friends with Gavin Fish and Sherrilyn Dale, and our special guests, Terra Newell and Collier Landry. What I recently spoke with, I don't know if you know of Stacy Peterson. She was married to Drew Peterson, and her body is still not found. He was a cop and had already killed another wife of his, and she knew about it, and then all of a sudden she went missing. And anyways, there was a Lifetime movie done there, Rob Lowe played him and Kaylee Cuoco, and so I think right now her sister is still actually trying to find her, and she doesn't have the resources to get the sonar dive equipment that she needs because she's in the ocean, or in a what would you call it?
A deep body of water.
Yeah, it's like a
submerged
canyon
body
of
of
sort.
water.
Yeah, it's not
water.
like an ocean. Yeah. So she kind of knows where she is, but doesn't have the resources. And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, they've done a Lifetime movie. What happens at that point? when they approach you to do a Lifetime movie of your life, your family, do you sign over these rights and now you have no nothing to it? Or do they help with the victims' families going forward? I'm very curious about it.
So I was lucky in a sense of that I was involved.
Okay.
Because I'm finding out that a lot of victims and survivors aren't involved in a lot of their stories.
Right.
So I was lucky in that sense. However, I deserve more money than I got compensated for. It's a scripted series, and then the podcast, I never got any money for that. I just got money for the scripted series and the documentary with Oxygen that got made. Wow. And then I'm finding out that it's really with talking to other true crime survivors, that there's really a hit or miss. Some people get a good dollar amount. Some people get a mid-dollar amount. Some people get low dollar amount, and some people get nothing.
Wow.
So it's really all ends of the spectrum, and I was somewhere kind of in the middle, we'll say. And there's a lot of people the Jeffrey Dahmer series, and Ryan Murphy, that's his name.
Yeah.
Ryan Murphy, he's not getting consent of the victims and the families that have been traumatized by this real trauma. and to other people. And, I worked in the media. I've done background, I've done stand-in positions. I thought it would be fun to be an actor at one point. Never like did that acting, but I worked in the industry, and my ex was a PA and did stuff with cameras and whatnot. And I've been in the industry now, but it's crazy that like when you see the media and everything, like you're so shocked, and you're so like glamorized. This like thing is so glamorized in a sense.
Yeah.
And so you're just looking at
Do you
this
mean the
like,
finished
oh
product?
wow.
You,
Well,
do you
like
mean the
just
finished product when you look at the actual show?
like when you look at any series, it's glamorized. It's
Yeah, like
they
when
put
you're
the
watching, they make the story as a whole like this, like you say, Gavin, murder porn, and people are like desensitized to it because it's become this non-reality almost.
where like the OJ Simpson story is cool in a sense. And a lot of people think differently about that for sure, but there are the people that are like, oh wow, he got away with murder. That's crazy. And
Right.
there are people that are legit upset about it, like the sister,
Of
Nicole's
course.
sister. And, there's real people involved. Yeah. And Collier
Cool.
works in the industry. So, he even knows a lot more about this too, because he's worked in it for a long time. He's a DP, and he like told his story after the fact that he's worked in the industry for a while.
Right. I saw your documentary. It was so beautiful. I actually I
Thank
had
you.
a question about it when you were putting it together and watching like Little Collier. Did you just want to put you in your pocket? Like how was that to like differentiate from like who you are today to watching you on the stand then?
So, what I would say was probably the most interesting thing for me was so I'm sitting in the theater in New York on our when we first for our world premiere, like U.S. world premiere, and I'm watching this I'm watching this kid on the witness stand going, huh, why is like this kid, like this is me, like this is
Right.
still me. I'm just a little bit older. I'm the same snarky sarcastic, same snarky sarcastic self. I mean, there's so much of this, and I was just like, oh my god, that's so funny. So that's what it was for me.
Okay, I love it. So, I guess what I'd really like to do, and I think this is going to help Gavin as well, because Collier, before you got on, Gavin was just kind of letting Tara know that true crime is definitely not his wheelhouse in like the traditional sense of somebody having like any interest in it. He really wants to solve, as many cases as he can and advocate for families and survivors and stuff like that. So it's definitely the same vibe that you guys have, and where I want to be in terms of helping victims. But so for somebody like Gavin who would not be on top of all of the true crime stories, whoever wants to start, I want to know from both of you. But can you guys kind of give us a little insight of like why you guys are here, in your position in life right now? What brought you here?
Sure.
Why don't we start with Collier since your story was first?
Well, it's interesting because I think this is very common for both Tara and myself, which is, we didn't ask to be a part of this. Like we didn't ask to be a subject of a true crime series, right? We got sort of forced into this situation. And I think that for me, it was this sort of, I needed to do something with my story. I needed to do something with my mother's story. I needed to honor her because I was very sort of, I wouldn't say obsessed, but I guess maybe obsessed, not obsessed, but I was very sensitive to the fact that after what happened to my mother, after what happened to me, that I saw how people reacted to the consumption of the case, whether it be in my own town, whether it be people I would meet in the state of Ohio when I would travel, whatever it was. And that was, everybody is very immersed in the drama of the bad guy, the crime, the perpetrator, the crime, what happened to the victim. And there's this weird sort of thing that seemed to shift where as soon as the gavel hit and we said next, right? That it ended up being this whole other, it was like out of sight, out of mind. And we never really examined the consequences of violence. We never examined how, when we were, it just essentially just stopped right with that, right? We were fascinated up until a certain point. Then the gavel hits. It's like the bad guy goes to jail. The state gets its restitution. The gavel hits, and we say next. And we don't ever examine the consequences of violence on family, not only on families and victims, right? But the ancillary victims, like the people who were like the best friend of the victim, the kids' schoolmates at class at school when this happened, the community as a whole, the prosecutor, their family, the police department, the detectives, this, that. We don't look at the ramification on the community, the ripple effects of violence. And that is only, in my opinion, become something that has been sort of the moment, fashionable, whatever you want to call it, apropos, recently. Like I would say in the last 10 years, we've become really like, oh, what happened? What are the real, and now everybody's, and I wouldn't call it like wokeism or anything like that, but I would call it like, oh, everybody's like, now we're hyper aware that, oh, these bad things have consequences that are far reaching outside of the scope of just the crime, the bad guy, the victim. You know what I mean? Because we're seeing these ripple effects and how it affects communities. And you can take that, into recent things like the Las Vegas shooting, right? And how that impacted a community there. You can look at, the murder of Michael Brown, right? And the community of Ferguson, right? And the rise of ultimately the Black Lives Matter movement. The wake of the victims of Harvey Weinstein, just to use things that are off topic, right? Top of mind for us recently. Right? Unfortunately, you have Jeffrey Epstein, and then the recent conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell, and in these things, like, oh, we're really aware of those, and so now we're looking at those like, oh, so this is what happened to the victims of being sex trafficked, for example. This is what happened to the family, of an activist. An activist's son was lynched in a tree, for example, right? All these things that are far reaching into communities and that contribute to, I wouldn't say an error of distrust, but I would say that when we now talk about, and this is just to jump ahead, but when you talk about ethical true crime, you have these things where people are examining these stories and they're not looking at the full scope of them, and then that ultimately affects people because it plays upon their distrust of the personal, whether it be the system that they're involved in, or whatnot. And then you look at that, those ramifications then leading into things like incarceration reform, right? Prison reform. Like I was on an interview earlier today with an inmate who has been convicted rightfully of murder since he was the age of 17. So even discussing like how those things impact communities that lead to people to have, if you don't have a proclivity towards violence, you will gravitate towards it because there's nothing else, right? Or you get involved in the wrong situation. That's really
wild
long-winded
that you're
answer.
saying this,
That's
because
a really
Gavin
long-winded
just
answer.
did this today too. No, I love that.
Yeah.
But Gavin literally just had this same day as you, and we just had this conversation about like systematic justice and situations. That's wild.
Colliers, how old were you when it all happened?
Yeah, so I was 11 years old when it happened, when I witnessed the murder happen, and I was 12 when it went to trial, when I testified.
So I remember when I was in 6th grade, I had a classmate whose mom died expectedly. She was ill, right? But the effects that had on him, actually, I remember he beat up a teacher at our school because he wanted to leave and the teacher didn't want him to leave. He just needed to leave, right? And then here I am, however many years later, 35 years later, that still affects me. The whole idea that you have to allow somebody who is grieving to grieve right? So everything that you're saying right there is like I completely identify with it. My question to you is when you're in fifth and sixth grade and you're dealing with the murder of your mom, what does that look like in your daily life? You still had to go to school, right? You still had to live. What did that look like?
Well, I mean, the first part of that was when, the 25 plus days of when my mother was missing, right? So school became a place for me to safely talk to detectives about what was going on, whether it be an observance of my father's behavior, whether it be ultimately when I found the photographs of the house and his mistress in front of the fireplace that was wrapped in plastic, which is ultimately where they dug my mother's body up from underneath that house that he purchased in another state. So there were lots of things that were going on in that particular situation where it had nothing to do with school. It had to do with being safe, if that makes sense. So I had that sort of situation. And then obviously her body is found. My father is arrested. I testify at the grand jury. And then because of that testimony at the grand jury, I am then orphaned by my family. Father's side of the family wants nothing to do with me. You're putting your father in prison. Mother's side of the family says, we want nothing to do with you because you look like your father, which I don't. But that was their way of coping with it. And look, people cope with trauma in all sorts of ways. It doesn't necessarily mean it makes any sense or it's right or it's fair, but the world is not fair, right? Then I had to sort of go through that process. And because of my mother's role in not only the school, but the community, my mother had a lot of friends. And those friends that were my friends were also loved my mother. So then I not only had to deal with my own sort of grief, but I found myself in a position as a kid where I was essentially, finding myself helping others grieve, right? And so there's a little bit of that common ground in it, in a sense, because you end up with yourself trying to process everything. You then end up going through your grief while helping others cope with the same grief, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think also because you are like very, like as a young child, you were an old soul. That's what I grabbed from you, like hearing your testimony and stuff. So that's, if I were to say, okay, well, that without knowing you and just seeing that on interviews and stuff like that, that sounds right, because it's almost like you had this like nurturing side of you anyways. And I think that was also like you like not even knowing that you were also that for your mom, right? Because like your mom and you were so close and she wasn't with your father. So that's actually really interesting that you kind of took on that role after, of just being this like caretaker at such a young age.
Yeah, I mean, caretaker essentially of myself, right?
Right.
And I guess,
but
others,
looking out for others,
Yeah, well, I think, but that also I think is part of I think when you are sort of in a situation where you are grieving something that is so severe, it almost helps it helps to have something that distracts you, right? And I did a TED talk about this where I talked about like, approaching trauma in a way where you like being either of service or being of action really is what ultimately is what ends up leading you through that trauma, right? So you ultimately have this whole you're on this journey yourself, right? And then you sort of bring the other people with you in a way, but at the same time you're still coping. It's all about you. You're coping with it yourself too, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
How was it about like, and I want to get to Terra too, like, but you talked about at school you met with detectives and you had to go to the grand jury, you had to testify in court. That means that as a kid that's having to grow up really fast, you're just around a bunch of adults all day that are kind of shuttling you to and from and trying to get information out of you and direct you and all that stuff. How was that? I guess what would be your advice to people who might be in the same situation, maybe not necessarily as children, but having to deal with the mechanics of finding some type of what we call justice, but I don't think really is. But in this justice system, what's your advice to people that are going through that, dealing with the detectives and the prosecutors and everybody involved?
Well, it's challenging for certain. But I think for me, I was so laser focused on getting justice for my mother that nothing else really mattered. And I couldn't really sit and think about how bad my life was or what was going on, um, to a certain degree, because at the same, like, I was like, okay, if I start thinking about that, then it's probably over. Right.
Mm.
So I think that it was just a very focused, I'm in action sort of thing, moving forward, moving past it. What's next? What now? What am I doing? And leading through that action, right? I think for everyone, it's all, it's all sort of subjective. It depends on what you're doing and where you are at your life. Like you talked about me being carted back and forth with adults, right? So I was, for the most part, just raised, by my mother. So I was constantly treated not only like an adult, but I was around adults in adult situations, which is not necessarily the most ideal situation sometimes for people. But for me, it worked because I approached the situation as an adult, as part of sort of this whole, I can't remember what the term is in psychology or child psychology, but essentially it's like being dropped off a cliff onto a mattress, and then how far you spring back on that mattress depends on if you land in like your whatever, your fight or flight, I don't know if that's your cerebral cortex or what, but or you land more in your limbic system, or you land more in your frontal cortex, where you're thinking and you're of action, you're preparing. And I'm not a brain expert, but those systems where you understand what's going on, and you're like, I will cope with this once I'm done with this. That's what you have to sort of find. And it's like, that's like, I mean, there's the rub, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do you really, you just sort of go through it. I mean, we have Terra here, and Terra was attacked by a man who had the intent of killing her, right?
Yeah.
And so you have that, and so it's like, how do you even, like, when I talk to her, I probably, like, how does that come off, like, hey, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna focus, and survive.
Yeah, Tara, tell us about your experience.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it was crazy because I kind of got thrown into it of the sense like my mom met a psychopath, and then he came and terrorized our family in that sense. And then so I got thrown into it just by my mom. And so that was an interesting thing to get thrown into, your parent who's supposed to be like your protective figure and whatnot. And then I ended up getting attacked by this male. And, my body goes into fight or flight mode, and I have to fight for my life because my body was already preparing for this because I was being stalked. And when you're being stalked, you're already being hunted, and so that person, that predator, is going to go get his prey soon. So me as the prey was already feeling that there's a predator around me, and so my system was already on guard, and my amygdala was hyperactive, the prefrontal cortex of the brain that Collier was talking about. And so it's just crazy that you get thrown into this situation. And then I ended up having to fight my stepdad in the parking lot. He brought the knife. I actually was able to get the knife from him. My dog was with me in the attack. And then I defended myself. And then it was crazy because afterwards, like, you're in shock. And I definitely agree with Collier about, after everything happens, after like the for me, it's so different because I am alive here today, but there are people still grieving in my situation, even though that person was a bad man and that person was the person trying to attack me. and there's still grief, but I still had to appease to these people who were grieving because I was the person that killed him in a sense. And so I didn't want people to be mad at me for what I had to do in that situation. And then, it brings us on this journey where I felt like I had to speak up to take my narrative back. But of course, I had to like grieve for a while. And then the LA Times approached me, did this huge story. And then, so I really became an advocate for these victims. And then, leading into doing all these interviews, I met Collier on his podcast, a murder, or moving past murder. And he has the documentary Murder in Mansfield. But I met him on his podcast, and then that's how we actually connected, because we really aligned with what happened to us and, the ethics of true crime and all of that.
I wanted to know that how you guys had like connected. So it was an interview that you did, and then you jived.
Yeah, and then and I had said to I was as someone who, again, I set out to make a film about the consequences of violence, the murder of my mother, leading through trauma, focusing on these things, and then ultimately towards my own journey of healing. Right. I never set out to make a true crime film. So when I started doing my podcast last year, 2021, I, was just sort of telling my story, interviewing other people, sometimes weighing in on sort of cases or, from other people's perspective, from like my perspective, right? Unique perspective of a true crime survivor, right? But I didn't ever set out to like make a true crime podcast. I just threw it in that category because it is true crime, right? But then I started interviewing people like Terra. When I interviewed Terra, I just became so acutely aware of like, oh, wow, these victims are really exploited for their stories. And what a unique thing it was for me to be able to control my narrative from Jump Street, essentially. My whole journey was I moved to Los Angeles to become a filmmaker, right? Or, and I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to tell the story, right? There's not a lot of people that do that. But on the flip side, there are many people who find themselves in these situations. They're victimized, or they are a victim themselves, or they're a survivor, or whatever, and then it just takes on a life of its own through now, especially social media, TikTok, things of that nature. But then the media and the traditional forms of media, not the new media forms, traditional media, Dateline, 2020, Forensic Files, Unsolved Mysteries, whatever, what have you, right? And then it becomes a movie and a TV series on Lifetime and this, that, and the other. And it takes on this life of its own, sort of multi-headed, tetra-headed hydra. And you're just like, whoa, okay. And you realize the level of the exploitation, and you just go, okay, something needs to be, they need to talk about this a little more, and that's how we sort of land on this ethical true crime thing and, with Survivor Squad.
I love it. I think it's so awesome that that's the focus, and that you truly want to use your platform to raise that and hold people accountable. And Gavin and I both said, not that we've been perfect angels in our journey in terms of having, like true crime content, but that's very much like where our focus is in terms of victims and helping and raising this question, because you can, have the best of intentions as much as you want, but not everybody does. And when you start now that I've stepped back and really looked at like what's out there, I mean, it makes me really angry, actually. Like, I feel like if you've got a platform, why aren't you using it to have these conversations and hold people accountable and yourself accountable, like to do better and to lift voices like yours up, or and that's exactly what you guys are doing on your podcast. I mean, you guys are victims yourselves essentially, but want to raise other people up.
Well, and we're also letting survivors tell their story in their own words,
right?
Which is very rare. It's always someone else is telling their narrative. Someone else is doing this. And that's what makes our podcast unique, because not only have we both been through these things, but we also are able to connect with a fellow survivor and go, okay, we've earned our stripes too, and we're going to let you tell it in your own words. And we are able to get certain things out of people that people can also get out of us that we only talk about amongst ourselves. We don't talk, I don't, there are certain things that I only tell certain survivors and
Yeah.
people that I'm comfortable with and like my sort of like fam that I would never tell an interviewer, or I would never describe it in the way of the sort of detail or even laugh about it in a way, you know. And I think also part of it is too is it's interesting because these things like these podcasts and these channels and these companies, they make exorbitant amounts of money off of other people's misery. And then, you know, I find myself often, you know, there was a time when I started going viral on TikTok and people were excoriating me saying, oh, you're profiting off your mother's murder. I'm like, well, first of all, like,
Ooh.
I'm making no money. You know, a podcast doesn't have any, you know, it's not like the podcast has, you know, advertisers or anything. I'm doing it to spread awareness and raise awareness. But also, like, this happened to me. And if the police handled it as their missing persons case and I wasn't this mouthy, obnoxious little kid who convinced one detective to listen to him that his mother was actually murdered, my father would have gotten away with it. So it is very much my I am allowed to speak with absolute authority in this position, and I'm able to tell the story because I'm the survivor and I'm the one that this happened to. And by the way, my father tried to take my life twice. So let's not forget that, you know.
Right. And in the grand scheme of things, I mean, like when people say that, I mean, I just, oh, yeah, keyboard warriors are another topic. But, you know, like if you were
Well, it's the
really given
navigation
the
of
choice,
parasocial relationships, but yeah, the
you know,
parasocial relationships, yeah.
right. And what would you rather, you know, like, oh, I'd rather profit off of my mom's death. No, like I'd rather have my mom here. But this is the
Sure.
cards that I was dealt, you know. I mean, oh, that just.
One of the cases that was one of my first cases looking into, doing a YouTube channel was a case called Amanda Winkowski. The victim was named Amanda Winkowski, and um, she was somebody who was obviously murdered, but the system decided that it was better to be an overdose. I mean, she was found upside down, frozen solid, naked in a garbage can outside of the home of a rapist. And
Oh.
they called that an overdose. So I started digging into everything, and I was able to prove to the DA that the toxicology report proves that she did not overdose. The metabolites that you would expect to find in there are absent, right? So we got a little attention from a giant production company who shall remain nameless. But after a year of working with them to try, Tara, something you were saying before we really started, you know, a year of working with them to try to get that project off the ground. I was at the gym one morning listening to a playlist of the Beatles, and I hear Paul McCartney sing, "You never give me your money, only give me your funny papers." I sat there and I was like, why am I working so hard for this company that is working to make millions of dollars off of this family? And that was the moment that I realized I'm a participant in exactly what I don't want to participate in. Right?
Yeah. I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, that, when you're working in the media, it's all fun, it's exciting, and you don't really get that these people, it's actually like stories, actual traumas that are being exploited, and you don't get it until you're really in that person's shoes. And, I've worked a little bit in media, and, Collier's worked a lot in media before he even told his story, but I was so excited, all these, even we had like Amanda Knox on our podcast. She's going to be in one of the episodes. And I was so excited to see her story and realizing that was me in high school, excited to see this story. And then meeting this person and going through a trauma myself, I'm like, I can't believe I even thought that. I can't believe I was even excited because Hayden Panettiere was playing her, and I was like, oh, bring it on to, or what, I don't know, but she was in a lot of different movies during that time of my life, and so that made it so exciting to go watch Amanda Knox's story, who, Amanda didn't have anything really to do with that movie, and so it's just crazy that, you see something You get so excited about it, but you forget that there's a real person attached to it.
Yeah, that's so well said. And that's what I love that you do that on your podcast, but a lot on your, TikTok too. You definitely like take advantage of that true crime hashtag where you're forcing people to think about those things, like a sound bite of yours was used, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And went like pretty viral. What was that one, Tara? I didn't even look into it because I didn't even want to give it like traction.
Thank you. Well, thank you for not looking into it and not giving it traction. But it was so, knowing me, and there's been time apart from my story and apart from my trauma, I just wanted to go on TikTok and start to tell my narrative. And it was funny because Collier was like, I got the idea from Collier because he went on and started to tell his story. But I was like, how can I do my story? And I wanted to do it in different sequences. And so I hate to say it like this, but I wasn't even thinking it as like a sound bite that's like gonna get clickbait or anything. I was just like, I'm gonna go on and start to tell my story. So that just started me by introducing my name and being like, hi, I'm Tara. I killed my stepdad in self-defense. And I wore a Harley Quinn t-shirt, and the Harley Quinn t-shirt said Daddy's Little Monster. And I didn't really think that through. And so just me saying that with that t-shirt, like I'm not gonna lie, like I laugh a little bit about it, but like you have to understand that there's trauma attached to that. There's a real story attached to it, and it can't be joked about. And like this person, like when a client overshares, or like when you meet someone and they just like overshare, you cannot like think about it that way or do a joke about it that way. If you do repost it, like repost it in the sense like, hey, you need to check out this story, or hey, there's a little bit more to this, something like that. I appreciate those reposts.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
We try to be very careful now with wardrobe and TikTok.
Yeah. No more Harley Quinn shirts.
No more Harley Quinn shirts. No.
You guys just get on Zoom right before you go on. Like, am I good to record now?
How do I look? Yeah.
Yeah.
Tie-dye is okay, right? Blue? Okay.
We're ready.
Collier, I had a question for you from something you said earlier. Do you think you got justice for your mom?
Oh, 100%. No question. 100%.
Yeah.
I think that after, after getting the justice in the traditional sense of the word, then it was more so getting the recognition and getting the story out there in a way that it gets people talking about, again, consequences of violence, ramifications of violence, that ultimately became the real process, right? The justice sort of thing was, I mean, not that it was easy, because none of it was easy. It was excruciating. But I would say that the longer form, the long play of all this was not, the justice was pretty swift. It's the making something positive out of it that takes the longest. It is the more arduous of all of this, and is really the most intensive, because everything else seems to happen pretty quickly. But I want to go back to your point that you were talking about, the case that you were examining, that you had brought up and you had said to the investigators. One of the interesting things is, and this is like this double-edged sword of the scales of Lady Justice, if you will. You have people that demand very swift justice in these cases, or you have people who, like, we've got to find a perpetrator, right? Okay, somebody did this, we got to, and there's this rush. And then, there's the flip side of where then you have to do like proper detective work, proper police work. Or, you have something like a missing persons case and people go, well, the police didn't do anything about it. And it's, yes, that is a fact that the police didn't do anything about it, but why didn't they do anything about it? Oh, I don't know, because there's dozens of these cases that occur every day. So the level of sort of advocacy that a police officer can do, really until a detective gets a case, is something that is a lot more of a complicated process than one would think. It's not like, okay, they've got this, they've got a great lead, they're going to go hunt this down. It's like, there's so, unfortunately, the way the world works is there's so many of these cases. Like, let's just take my mother's disappearance, right? So it's a missing persons case. And unless this one detective believes me that my mother was murdered, it's going to be handled as such. Well, we all know that it wasn't a missing persons case, right? But that is such a common thing. And let's keep it real. Like, it's not a common thing with like people like myself. It's a common thing with mostly women.
Marginalized
that, there's
folks,
some sort of domestic or women, marginalized folks from marginalized communities, impoverished communities. I mean, where domestic violence is far more prevalent, right? Or at least more known to be prevalent, right? So you have these things of, you have these situations where, if I'm not an advocate for, or this annoying little kid, then the right eyes don't get focused on it. But again, these cases will often disappear into the shadows of yet another case. And really the thing that I look at is that isn't a failure of law enforcement. That is a failure of society as a whole, right? Because we have become tolerant of abuse. We have become tolerant of these situations, or we've become immune to them, maybe is the better word, not tolerant, but
like
immune.
socially acceptable too.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes we'll even blame the victim, right?
Well, sure. Well, that occurs later, but I think initially you get into these situations where you're looking at them through a lens of, well, yeah, of course it's happening again. Of course it's happening again. There's nothing I can do. And I think when you continue to have these conversations and bring this up, this is why, we were discussing with a fellow true crime advocate and podcaster, like, so, I feel like sometimes I overshare my story. She goes, no, she's like, I share my story every day. And this is why, because you never know who it's going to impact. And then it's going to be like, I'm like, that's a great point. You can't really overshare it, because if it reaches the right person at the right time, you might be able to make a real difference, whether that's the difference in taking someone's life, whether that's the difference in someone taking the right steps to find the loved one, or whatever that is, right? And then again, to your point, you have this situation where, on the flip side, you have people that do the victim shaming, the victim blaming. Oh, well, this person put themselves in these situations. Oh, this person stayed in the marriage because of this. Oh, this person, and it's like, it's not that simple, And again, when I was mentioning talking to the incarcerated individual today, what I'm fascinated in is like, what led to that, right? Oh, okay. Oh, so you came from a broken home. Oh, your mom was an alcoholic, left you when you were a baby. Oh, okay. Your father was also an alcoholic because of the community that you grew up in. Alcoholism is rampant in that particular community. Okay, so these are things, you weren't afforded these opportunities or a life that's normalcy. And then, of course, you got strung out on drugs, and then you committed this murder, and now you've been incarcerated for 35 years, and this all happened before the age of 17. Okay, got it. And I think that when we start to think about these things, and it's not having compassion, it's not only about having compassion or empathy or understanding, but it's not like, oh, you're feeling sorry for them, or you're somehow acknowledging that what they've done is acceptable. It's not that. It's that you need to understand these situations that cause these things in the first place. That's why having these conversations makes us think, like, what are we doing? Like, let's not start at they're in prison. Let's start at they're a kid, right?
Yeah, where the fracture was starting.
Where the fracture, if we start thinking about that,
yeah, I love that.
Then we won't have this.
Right. That's so powerful. Now, is that, because I want to ask about your guys' workshop. I'm so, like, I that was like one thing I said to Terra. I'm like, this is so awesome. So is that kind of also the hope too, is like not just for in advice in terms of toxic dating, but like figuring out, like having people aware, I guess, of like who you're being with or whatever, and thinking about those things and where they came from also. Like, I want to know more about the workshop.
Well, I wouldn't say it's like toxic dating. It's also like we're also offering a trauma workshop, right? And trauma recovery. And speaking about our personal experiences on those things, I think for people that are interested in the workshops, they are people that come to us that have already seen what we've been doing, and they're like, we want to know more. And Tara and I have gajillions of people that reach out to us. That's a real number, gajillions. Gajillions of people that reach out to us on social media or via email or whatever and contact us asking us for advice or, like, what is this? And this is that type of thing. It's that type of situation where people can come to us and have like a one-on-one or in a group setting where we can share sort of the cheat codes, if you will, of like, this is what we've done. And we're not therapists. We're not counselors. We're not mental health professionals. All but we are suggesting is like, this is what we went through. And look, your father didn't murder your mother. You weren't faced with a situation where your stepfather was trying to kill you, who was high on drugs, and you had to defend yourself. We're not looking for people those extreme. I mean, I'm sure there are people, but that's not the normal thing. But people who are also struggling with, maybe they were involved with a narcissist, maybe they're in a bad relationship, maybe they had a bad relationship with a parent, maybe they had this. How did they can glean things from us that they wouldn't get from other people because our circumstances are so extreme that's what that offers them. I'm going to let Terra weigh in.
I'm going to weigh in because, okay, so this is the 4th time that I've been doing this workshop, but this time I'm adding in Collier to it because he is a male. He's been through this great journey of transformation. He's done the work to get to a great place in his life and has great coping skills, all this stuff. And I've really done a lot of research in my own healing journey. I've done things that work for me, things that haven't worked for me. We're going to share them all. Each week you're going to learn about like different things, but each week there's going to be a live call with us. And then that's when you're going to be able to ask us questions, ask us about our experiences, ask our advice, anything that you want to know. That's the time to ask us. And it's really great because since this isn't my first workshop, I really got to see a lot of these people grow who have been at previous workshops. And a lot of these people are actually rejoining because they want to know Collier's experience from a male, because the only thing really missing from my workshops before was that other male experience. And so that's why it's going to be even better than, if you have done something with me in the past or with Collier, because you get both of us. And I think that is just amazing because you don't get to really, you get to deal with your trauma then, and you get to experts in it. And people who have come to me, they have really gone through therapy even, and their therapist isn't helping them. And this is really kind of like the last resort of like, what do I need to do? I've tried everything. And it's really great because you learn about the nervous system, you learn about past relationships, you learn about attachments, you learn about a lot of stuff that you didn't know about in the past. You learn about red flags, and it's just given tools and experts to help you guide through that process.
Yeah.
I love that. I do a series on my channel where I allow viewers to, or not allow, they write into me and then I read all of their emails on those episodes so that they can feel like they have a platform where they're being heard. So, like I know that a lot of my supporters are going to be very interested in this. So there's no, they don't have to have the similar story to you, like Collier was saying, like that was the max, right? So like anybody who's feeling like they just need to be heard and supported, and maybe just, like you said, sometimes listen, I've been through a lot of therapy in my life, and my favorite type of therapy is friend therapy. That you never really get that same, like, I don't know, resolve as you do when you talk to somebody who's been through a very similar situation, or like you said, the extreme, and you're able to relate, as opposed to sitting on a couch being, I don't know, nitpicked apart. And this is what you should do instead, Sherrilyn. And
well, I mean, that's also why Alcoholics Anonymous exists, right? Which is like the largest, most successful 12-step program in the history of the world, right?
Right.
Because the alcoholics are like, nobody else can understand what I'm going through unless you're an alcoholic.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And, it's the same thing. Your situation might not be the same or as extreme, but you find solace in knowing like, oh, okay, if that person, I mean, that's the biggest thing for me is that when people hear my story or this is a film or whatever, they listen to me, and I'm sure Tara would concur with this 100%, but they're like, look, if you can go through what you went through, I can sure as hell deal with my daddy issues or my, my shit, whatever that is, right? And I think that that's sort of, that's the thing, right? It's like, oh, okay, we're all human having a human experience, but we want to really touch that with others.
Yeah. And
And this is
trauma's
no different.
trauma.
And trauma's trauma.
Yeah, I love that actually because that took me a long time to learn too because I feel like it, like my trauma compared to somebody else's, I'm like, oh well, that wasn't even comparable, and it's everybody is different, right? That took me a long time to learn that. So I like that you just said that. So the workshop, is it one-on-one? Is it multiple people style? Like how does that work if somebody wants to register?
So if you want to register, we both have links in our bio, I think on Instagram. Also on my website, you could go straight to my website, Terra Newell Survival, and sign up there. There is 2 workshops. One is No More Toxic Dating, and the other is a trauma, no, moving past trauma. And they're both 5 weeks. Each week there will be a live call, an hour live call with us. And you'll get to interact even with other people. You get to ask us questions, but each week there is homework. And you don't have to like complete the homework. It's not like you're going to get in trouble, but there is homework, if you want to actually do the work. Right. And I think it's so important to, and I have like a book, like lots of books recommended. So like this is 5 weeks where, and I recommend everybody to kind of tell their friends like, hey, I'm going to be doing this workshop. I'm going to be in my healing journey. I don't really want to go out drinking and stuff. I want to, don't date during that time really because you're going to be raw and you're going to be vulnerable. And if you're dating, you're going to be acceptable to those toxic people because you're in that emotional state.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I never even considered that. Okay, so these are great tips. I'm going to put the link to, I'll go and find those so that we can have it on this
I'll make sure Tara
episode.
emails you for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question about just something that both of you brought up. I'd love to hear your response first, Tara, and then Collier you. But at some point after this trauma happened for both of you, right? And like, forgive me, but Tara, I think forgive me for maybe characterizing this incorrectly, but that trauma of having to defend yourself happened in a moment, right? It was momentary and it was almost animalistic, right? But at some point, you were probably interviewed by police and you had to tell them what happened, right? And the reason that I'm thinking about this is because, Collier, you brought up the one detective who believed you that this was not a missing persons, this was a murder case, right? So I'm curious to hear both of you maybe express to us maybe the qualities of the people that you spoke to who are the most helpful in the law enforcement side of things, right? The detectives, the investigators, maybe the trauma, counselors or whatever. Who were the people as you were going through this journey within the system? Who were those people that helped the most, and how was it that they were most helpful?
For me, it was really interesting because we tried to get the police involved at first. We tried to get restraining orders and we weren't able to. We were told we were crazy. Oh, it sounds like you're just like, in an argument with someone. And we were really brushed aside. And even when John lit my mom's car on fire, my high school officer actually got that case and he went on a couple of vacations, and I even saw him afterwards and he felt very badly about everything, and I didn't understand until I talked to my mom and talked to her that like she would call him all the time and tell him that she was in fear for her life. So in that case, like I feel that, and I actually wrote an article. I don't think it's out there anymore because something happened with my past website. But I wrote an article about Unbelievable, that series, and the difference between the cops who were interrogating these victims. And there was such a difference. There was a male white cop who was harsh. He didn't really believe the person. He kind of brushed like what she was saying aside. She was emotional, so he didn't take her seriously. There was another case where this woman cop went to this girl. She pulled her aside. She was like, "Hey, I want to bring you to a safe area so we can talk safely. I want to know, like, let you know you're safe now. You know, what do you need from me before we start asking questions?" She was sensitive about the questions. She was carefully asking the questions. She was nurturing to her in the sense with boundaries. And I thought that it was great how she handled it, opposed to this other person who was abrupt. He was kind of like, "Oh, I don't believe her." And you really get the energy, and you really have to come at these victims with calm energy and like, "Oh, okay, I believe you. Like, what happened? Tell me what happened. You know, from your own words. I'm here for you." Because what these people really need is a safe figure after something completely traumatized their lives and wrecked their lives in this sense.
In any point during like your statements and stuff, Tara, did you ever have somebody who was like aggressive?
I had a lot of males around me. They were asking me questions abruptly. They told me even that my mom went to go be with her husband when really they asked her to go identify him. And so they were not kind to me. They were rude to me. They didn't handle the situation well. I did not feel safe. However, I did have my dog there, and that made me feel somewhat comforted, where I was able to answer these questions to them. And I knew that I wasn't going to be in trouble. I just had that feeling because I didn't bring the knife there. I tried to run away from him. I did everything I could to avoid that situation. I just had to do what I did because if he's on top of me, he's going to get the knife. I have to
Right.
take the knife. I have to do what I did.
Right, 100%. So it was easier for you to at least be like, you know, the evidence is stacked up, I know that I did everything okay, regardless
Yeah.
of how you're coming at me.
I think when you're innocent, you just speak with conviction.
100%. The truth is the easiest thing to remember.
Yeah.
Right, right.
That's the thing. If people ask me about my testimony, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, you're so good on the witness stand. You know, obviously you were coached." And I'm like, no. I'm like, the reason why it's so pure it flows is because the truth is the easiest thing to remember, and when you're telling the truth, it is so pure it flows. And you know, I said, you know, I was on the witness stand for 2 days as a 12-year-old kid. To think that I could somehow remember some rehearsed script is utterly fanciful. I mean, most adults couldn't remember something and testify for 15 minutes in a courtroom in such a high pressure situation, let alone a child. So yeah, it's ridiculous, but you know, you have that.
So Collier, that detective that believed you, what was it about him that made him that way, or her? I don't know.
Him, you know, no, Dave Messmore. I mean, he just, I, I think that it was just the perfect storm of the fact that when, you know, I pulled him aside and I said, "Give me your card," and then I think it was like the conviction that I had, like that was ultimately what made him go, "Okay, this kid really believes this," and I had the evidence to back it up. That's the thing too, is that I had, you know, I had all the stories about my father's proclivity for violence, the way that he was violent towards me and my mother, the mistress, the whole thing. And that ultimately is what, you know, let him, because he went out on a limb, right? He didn't, you know, just it wasn't like, like my father was a doctor in a small town in not rural, but in Ohio, a Midwestern town.
Small
Like you
town.
don't just,
Yeah.
you don't just go after the doctor, you know what I mean, without like some sort of overwhelming avalanche of evidence. And so even his captain was like, we're not going after this guy. Are you out of your mind? He's going to sue us. And Dave was like, but this kid, I think he was convinced that I was going to haunt his dreams if he didn't do it. But yeah, this is also sadly the ramifications of being the last child in your friend group that gets a Nintendo. So, your imagination is running wild.
Oh my gosh.
I was hoping that would land. Maybe there was a delay. I was like, is that joke going to land?
So don't get your kids a Nintendo, guys.
You want to stay safe.
Oh my gosh. Thank you guys so much. I honestly, I like I said, I mean, Terra, now when you were like, oh, I was excited to talk to him, and I was like, okay, well, I was excited to talk to you guys just to as individuals, not to talk about what happened and that there's all the movies and the documentaries, but just like what you guys have been able to do for survivors. And
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and our podcast comes out first quarter next year, probably January. And,
Okay.
you guys can find us on all the socials. I have at Collier Landry. We have at Survivor Squad. Terra has hers.
At Terra Newell.
My podcast is called Moving Past Murder. The new one with Terra is called Survivor Squad. So we're looking forward to sharing those stories with the world. We've got a lot of great interviews lined up.
Yes.
That's amazing.
That are
So
gonna
we've
come
got we'll have them. You guys will have to definitely keep me posted. I'm gonna have everything linked in this episode, anyways. But when you guys are live and ready, I'll give everybody a quick reminder.
Yeah, and support our Patreon as we get live and
Yes.
ready. Yes, we have a Patreon.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks,
There's
guys.
like lots of behind the scenes stuff on there.
Yeah, there is. That's
Yeah.
great stuff.
See, I love that. I that's the only reason why I think I would want to do the Patreon route is to get all that behind the scenes stuff.
Yes.
Right?
Okay, well,
Everybody
that's good.
smile.
Now-
Everybody smile for the Patreon.
Thank you guys so much.